keep coming in. But I'm a little concerned about this. I'm a walker, so if I trip and break my leg, then just help me to a seat or something. Or I don't know if this is because of black. I'm disinvited next time or something like that. But welcome. If you don't know me, my name is Derek, and I've been here several times. Always enjoy coming to St. Matt. So it's good to be with you again. And today our topic is the book of James and the book of Hebrews. So in the past, I think actually this year, I talked about the book of James over the course of a couple of weeks. So I didn't think I would say that much about James, since obviously you know everything there is to know about James since we talked about it several months ago. But does anyone have any questions about James, or if you remember anything? I can say a couple of things about James. I can say as much as you want, actually, about James. Refresh our memories. Refresh our memories. The book of James. So, in the early tradition, the customary author was James, who was the brother of Jesus. He's called James the Just. He was also James the Bishop of Jerusalem. And he was martyred in the 60s, in the year somewhere in the mid-60s, from Jerusalem, that he was supposedly thrown off the temple, and that's how he died. So that is an early tradition, and it's attributed to him as Jesus' brother. It's possible that he was the author of the book. There are some similarities between his teachings and Jesus's, especially on the Sermon on the Mount. And that's really the only book in the New Testament that has a lot of similarities between Jesus' direct teachings. So if you read Paul's letters, as you all have, Paul doesn't interact with any of Jesus' direct teaching. And actually, no one else does really, except for some parts of the book of James. So that's a potential. Another thing is James, whoever wrote this book, uses very good Greek. And the Greek in the whole New Testament, the best of it is in James and also in Hebrews. So it's possible that Jesus' brother, who grew up speaking Aramaic, was also secretly a very good Greek speaker and could not just speak good Greek, which we assume Jesus could also speak some Greek, and everybody probably would have been able to speak Greek, but that he was trained rhetorically in Greek, and it uses a lot of rhetorical devices. It's very familiar with the Greek Old Testament and not the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. So those are kind of some of the things. We could go into more. I don't think it really matters either way who wrote the book. I am disinclined to think that Jesus' brother wrote the book. It's possible, but a lot of scholars want to put it actually several decades after his death, and maybe even into the 2nd century. I don't know if it should be that far, but it certainly raises some questions whether he would have been able to write that. So that's the issue with the authorship. Any questions on that or thoughts? Did you start reading James yet, or are you right in the middle of it? Oh, you haven't. Oh, you read Hebrews first. Okay, yeah. All right. When we'll get to, I have actually a handout on Hebrews. I was thinking we'd spend most of our time on Hebrews. But, well, let's talk about a couple of things in James. If you want to open up your Bibles. 980. I wrote my PhD dissertation on James, so I've spent a lot of time with him over the years. I don't as much anymore. There's just only so much that you want to be investing in one particular topic. Yeah, I learned more than anyone should know about this book. I think for a couple of reasons. One, the Greek in here is just very different from the Greek we assume that Jesus and his disciples would have been able to speak. Now, I think that they could speak Greek, but this is at a very high level. This Greek is more sophisticated than Paul's Greek, and Paul would have been a native Greek speaker, and he would have actually been trained rhetorically. So that's one thing. Another is that there is a later tradition that this book is used several decades after we would originally think. So in other words, when we look at what's called the canonical history, when we have the earliest manuscripts and when it was accepted as part of the Bible and not accepted, it took a very long time before it was accepted by the early church. And that doesn't make as much sense. If James would have written it, and if he was the brother of Jesus, then there would be no skepticism whatsoever about the book. And because there was, that makes me think that it's possible that he didn't write it. So let's look at some things. Oh, yes, ma'am.
What James do you think wrote it then? What back then?
I don't know.
Some other scholar named James?
Well, not necessarily a scholar, but these names, and this is the difficulty, and actually James, it's Jacob. The name is Jacob. And so it's just a matter of history that it's called James, but actually his name is Jacob, and it's not James, so it's going back to the patriarch Jacob. And it's the same thing with Jesus, right? Jesus' name is actually Joshua. We call him Jesus. James's name is Jacob. Welcome to Christianity. So I don't know who wrote it, and James was a very common name, or actually Jacob was a very common name. So it's the same thing with John. There's a lot of Johns. The Gospel of John is nowhere identified that John wrote the book. The person who wrote it, we assume, is the person whom Jesus loved. That's the name that's given as the person who was involved with that. And then for the 3 letters of John, those are not attributed to John. It's written by an elder, and then only the book of Revelation says that John is the author. And so early tradition says that John wrote all of those. I think that there's not very good indication, but Jacob's a very common name, so it could be anyone. But there are lots of Jacobs or Jameses.
This
Yeah.
is going back to a couple of weeks ago
Mhm.
when we were talking about the letters of Paul and which ones could be attributed to him versus someone else. And I'm looking behind my reading, so I'm still on some of the letters. When he says, when Paul says he's actually writing from being incarcerated, is he really writing it himself, or is he still dictating? Those are written by him?
No, great question. And I was here a couple of weeks ago talking about some of Paul's letters. I think I had the pastoral letters,
Yeah.
and then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Philemon. So you know, we talked about some of these things, but in case you weren't here, just here's what I said. There are 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. Most scholars would say that 7 of those letters are actually from Paul. And those would be Philemon, of all the ones that I taught, only Philemon, and 1st Thessalonians, and then Romans, the 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. Yeah, I think, so is that 7? You can count in your head. It's those 7. The ones that are not from Paul are certainly not the pastorals, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and then 2nd Thessalonians is sometimes questioned, or oftentimes questioned. Ephesians and Colossians is often questioned as well. So that is what many scholars believe. No one really argues that Paul did not write those 7 letters, so we can assume he wrote those. But when we say wrote them, I think that it was more flexible, so that other people were involved in the process. And if you look at a lot of the letters attributed to Paul, there's co-authors. Could be someone like Timothy who's involved in that, or someone else, Silas. So I think if Paul wrote those, he wrote them in a community.
Even though he says I'm incarcerated, I'm
Mhm.
writing from being incarcerated.
Yeah, I mean, other people would have helped him in the writing process. So Paul didn't actually write any of them with his hand.
Right.
Anything he wrote is something he dictated to someone else. So, yeah, I think some of those are mostly coming from Paul, but we don't know to what extent. And a lot of scholars also say that, yeah, even though Paul says I'm in prison or certain, doing these certain things, that was a common literary device, and people could write in Paul's name. And it was an honor, it was an homage, it was not something that was, under the table or sketchy or something like that.
Isn't there one place where, I can't remember, something out here where Paul writes this in my own name?
Yeah, that's 2 Thessalonians, and it's the very end of 2 Thessalonians. A lot of scholars say that he didn't write that. So I actually remember when I was in seminary, these many years ago, and the professor told me, it was a well-known New Testament scholar, he's written a lot of books and so forth, and he said, Paul did not write 2 Thessalonians. And on the final exam, the question, did Paul write 2 Thessalonians? And of course, I don't do well with authority. And I just disagreed with him anyway. And so I said, of course he wrote 2 Thessalonians, and here's why. And of course he gave me an F on that paper. Because to me, at that time in my life, it was a decade ago, it just seems stupid, silly for someone to write, I'm writing this in my own hand, and then for it not to be him. But scholars say, well, of course, someone is writing that because Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, and people question whether that was from him, and so someone else wrote later in his name and saying, I'm defending this. Scholarship silly. Yeah. It's best just to ignore everything they say and read your Bible. But remember, I have no opinions whatsoever when it comes to the authorship of the Bible. And a lot of people will state claims and say, this person wrote that. But there's no way to know that. And I think in the end, it doesn't really matter who wrote any book in the Bible. And when it comes to the Old Testament, we don't know who wrote any book in the entire Old Testament. And so Old Testament scholars aren't nearly as concerned about saying, well, Ezra was written by Ezra, or Samuel was written by Samuel, or, Lord forbid, Isaiah wrote Isaiah, or something along those lines. For New Testament scholars, it's much more urgent for them to say that James was written by the brother of Jesus, or that Jude was written by the brother of Jesus, or that 1 Peter was written by Peter the disciple, and so forth. I don't think that's really necessary, and we certainly know more about the New Testament authorship than the Old Testament authorship, but it's looking into the Son and saying, I can't make out who wrote that. So let's look at the book of James. Just a few things, and to get us thinking about how inadequate we are before God. One of the main things of James is good deeds. And so I just wanted to look at a couple of things, and then we can kind of feel bad about ourselves. If you look at chapter 1, verse 22, someone want to read verses 22 to 25? Yeah, chapter 1? Okay. All right, John, right? I know. All right, Ed's got it. The voice of God, right. Ed is the voice of God, so it's wonderful.
But be doers of the word, and not merely hearers, who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and, on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing.
That is the voice of God. Yeah. Yeah.
If I
Right.
go on putting the tongues, just
Yeah, no, that's all right. That's all right. Ed, do you want to read one more? Would you like to read 3:13? We'll just give you one verse.
Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And the harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace.
Thanks. Everybody following along this and doing this in their weekly lives and so forth?
They
Okay.
should have read this before the presentation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, and one more thing, we don't have to read this because it's a long section, but if you just glance at chapter 2, verse 14, all the way to 26, where the whole section is about doing good deeds and your faith in relation to your good deeds. So, all of this is to come to the question, James thinks that good deeds are essential to the Christian life, and he tells us specifically what he's thinking about if you look at the very last couple of verses in chapter 1. He says, real religion in the eyes of God our Father, verse 27, is this, coming to the help of orphans and widows in their hardships and keeping oneself uncontaminated by the world. So, I thought we could just go by one and tell us what good deeds you did this week. Or actually, yeah, yesterday, because I'm sure you did several good deeds yesterday.
Before you get started. And
Yeah.
that is kind of addressed to everybody, because we're discussing. Lots of times, I'm getting a message from Dave's daily commentary before we read that several times he mentioned it's not the good deeds, it's your belief and your belief in Christ as being resurrected and coming again. And I think don't you think that's been mentioned several times? And I get it's like don't think the good deeds is what it's all about.
Mhm.
It's really your belief. And so this is kind of like
Goes
opposite. It's
against the
like
grain.
The emphasis is good deeds.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And
So there's like is it verse in it or
I think it is a both and, but here's what's interesting is the general letters. So we're now entering the general letters. There's Paul's letters, and those are the ones everyone reads and likes or hates. But no one reads the latter part of the New Testament. That's the neglected part. It's called the general epistle. So Hebrews is part of that, but then the 7. And that includes James and 1st, 2nd Peter, Jude, and 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and John, and so forth. But yeah, these have a very different feel to them. And James is the first of those 7 letters, and it starts in a very different direction, I think. It's not completely opposed to Paul. You can reconcile them, but in the history of Christianity, people have really de-emphasized or shown the dissonance between the two. And so James is a good example. James is almost always put in contrast to Paul.
Isn't it, if you do good deeds without Jesus in you, then it's not worthy, it's not quite as, it's not genuine, it's not
Yeah.
unless you have Christ behind you or with you.
Yeah.
in the same deed.
The book of Hebrews talks about that. There's several, it uses the word dead action, at least my translation uses dead action several times. And that's the whole idea. It's like we're not about doing dead action, but it's about lively action. So action based off of Christ. But one thing, the Catholic Church really does like the book of James. And they like some of the general epistles. They emphasize it more than Protestant churches emphasize Paul, for the most part. This is generally speaking. A lot of Protestant churches emphasize Paul, and that's because the Protestant Reformations were based on new readings of Paul. They weren't based on new readings of James or new readings of the general epistles. So Protestant churches, by and large, emphasize Paul and a specific understanding of Paul, and they're reading that within a context they think of legalism, and so they think Paul is a good advocate of faith and faith only, whereas the Catholics will emphasize a lot of the general letters, like James, emphasizing good deeds, cooperating with our faith. So they're not opposed to each other necessarily, but they can be certainly in tension with each other. But James is very clear. When you read through James in the next few days or next couple of weeks, just pay attention to how much he talks about good deeds and things like that. So what do we do with that? It's uncomfortable. James is great because he makes us uncomfortable, right? He hates rich people, which you'll see in chapter 5. And for a lot of us who would want to emphasize, it makes things a lot easier for us if we just have to have faith, right? But if we actually have to do stuff, it's where it gets in our way.
And sometimes it's easier the other way.
Just to do stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's easier to do good stuff because that's tangible and you can do it, whereas to be totally convinced of your, solid faith and
Mhm.
your belief is, that can
Yeah.
be, that's harder.
Yeah.
Who wrote Faith Without Works is Dead? Who wrote
That was James. And that's in that section, 2:14 to 26.
Faith Without Works?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
I knew it was somewhere.
The way I figured what Dave had to say about faith, like you were saying, I know that I've read James many times. He's one of my favorites, and book is where he is.
Maybe it is James, brother.
It's all about a practical approach. Is how I think of the book of James. And I was thinking, like when you were raising the topic there, I don't always set out to do good. I don't even know exactly what is good sometimes. I don't set out to do it, but it's almost like a check. I already have the faith and I have the belief system going, and so therefore my actions of every day, I could then bounce them off that belief system. Does that make sense? Because that way I can include what you said about what Dave was saying.
Yeah.
It's faith. Because I do believe in the action part too, but it's almost like an acting out of what I believe. It's not like the works are going to make me believe something. It's not the other way around.
Yeah. And it's always a context. And so that thing, some scholars will say James is speaking out of a context where Paul was taken too far. So Romans 6 about should we, sin, keep on sinning so that God's grace continues to abound. Right? And so people pushed on Paul and said he was an antinomian, which means he's against the law, so that you can do whatever you want because God's grace is so big. And it's hitting off the idea, Martin Luther famously said, sin boldly. And what he meant by that is you can take your worst sins to God and do the most horrible things because God's grace is so much larger than we could ever imagine. So, if you're going to sin boldly because you have a big God who's going to forgive you. You can see how that will be taken out of context. However, that's some people think is what's going on here with James. James writing out of a context where faith was pushing too far and say, yeah, we can do anything now that we have faith. And he's saying, no, you actually have to have it expressed by good deeds and so forth. So you could be in opposition to Paul, or it could be a nice, push to Paul or correction to Paul or something along those lines. We're at the half-hour mark, so I want to move into Hebrews, make sure we have some time for that. But any more, just a final thought on James? Okay. So, let's look at the book of Hebrews. I have a handout for Hebrews. Oh, great, thanks. So that'll be passed out. And what chapter you are on Hebrews now? Chapter 7? Oh, okay. So what's today? The 7th. So you should have already read chapter 7 this morning. I read the whole book of Hebrews this morning, and the whole book of 2 Samuel already. So come on, you can. No, I got up at 4. I couldn't sleep. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Wasn't that? So the book of Hebrews, here's a handout for us as we think about it. If you want to start on page 1, we'll just go through a few things and then we can talk about some specifics. As for authorship, it's somewhat similar to the book of James. as I mentioned earlier, I really don't have any idea who wrote the book of James. Neither do I have any idea who wrote the book of Hebrews. There have been different suggestions over the years. One of those is that Paul wrote it, which is certainly possible. And the main reason why Paul is seen as the author is because there's 13 letters attributed to Paul. And if you add one more, it's 14 divided by 2, which is 7. That's a perfect number. And that gives you 7 general epistles as well. So if you have 13 by Paul, 1 from someone who wrote Hebrews, and then 7 others, it doesn't work out as well. But if you can have 7, 7, 7, that's much better. Sounds silly to us, but for them it makes sense. Yeah, I don't think Paul wrote the letter. Paul has a very different language, and his concepts are very different from the book of Hebrews, in my opinion. Another person is Clement. Clement is of Rome, and Clement wrote First Clement, which was written in the 90s A.D. We have his letter. There's also a Second Clement, which he probably did not write, but there's some similarities there. Another one is Barnabas, and Barnabas was a companion of Paul. We read about him in the book of Acts. It's possible. Next one is Luke. It does fit well with Luke's writing style. Luke was a very sophisticated writer, and he seems to have some similarities with this book. Apollos was one. Martin Luther suggested many authors, and Apollos is one of those. Apollos is also one that we meet in the book of Acts. Prisca, Adolf Harnack. Of course, we have to have someone offer the idea that a woman wrote the book after centuries of men only being considered. So Adolf Harnack threw Prisca and Aquila into it as the author of the book. The problem with that is it's not in English, but in Greek, there's a masculine participle that's used in one of the words, and it's obviously masculine. So either we can say, well, obviously a man wrote it because a woman would use a feminine participle, or she knew that her work would not be received well if a woman had written it, so she changed the participle into a man. So that is a possibility. And of all the New Testament books, this is actually, of all the books in the Bible, this is the only book that has any possibility of being written by a woman. So if you're excited about that, then let the world know. Write a blog or something along those lines. And the best answer, I think, is we have no idea. As for dates, there's a range of dates which I think are not really that helpful. They're just people making up stuff. 60s to the 90s, maybe. Some people think that the temple is not mentioned, so therefore it had to be written before the temple was destroyed. Or some people say, well, the temple was not mentioned, so it was written after the temple was destroyed. So either way, it's not really helpful. What we do know is, as is the case with a lot of these titles, the word to the Hebrews was written, or the first evidence we have is in 200 or so A.D. So the letter, however it was written, whoever wrote it, there was no title associated with it. So that was something that was added later. The audience, this is my best understanding of the audience. It's Jews and Gentiles. It's not just Jews, even though when you read through it, you think, well, there's a lot of Old Testament imagery and concepts and language. It must just be Jewish people. I think it's clear that it's not just Jewish people. It's Jewish and Gentile people. And there's probably a mixture of recent converts, Gentile, and then also Jewish converts to Christianity. And the major issue is trying to understand how to be a Christian in relation to what we have been our whole lives. If you're Jewish or if you're a Gentile, how do you enter this faith that's already been ongoing and yet there's a new aspect to it? Canonical history, there's nothing really to say other than the first indication we have of it is really around 200, and you see it, there's early contention whether this is a book that should be in the New Testament. So all the letters after Paul, every one of them has been contested. 1 John and 1 Peter, not so much, but every other book, there's a lot of disagreement on whether it's part of the New Testament canon for the first several hundred years.
Because of why?
because, one, because there is no early evidence of it. And so we have, for the 4 Gospels, for Paul's letters, not the pastorals, but the other 10, there's really good evidence early on. So we have, by 2nd century, people are making indications about it. We don't have that for these other general epistles, and because it's questioned who wrote these. So for the Gospels, even though all of the Gospels are actually anonymous, and it's the case that the church just wrote according to John, according to Matthew, but from the very beginning it had been associated with one of those people. It wasn't necessarily the case with some of these journal epistles.
So it has nothing to do with the content. I mean, the content.
It does have, yeah, actually does a little too. So James, we hit on some of that, the 2:14 to 26 piece where he says you're justified by your works
Yeah.
and not by your faith alone.
Yeah.
So they actually, Protestants are known for faith alone. The only time that occurs in the whole Bible is in James, and it's preceded by the word not. Not faith alone. So you can see how it's not a favorite passage for many people in Christian history. Same thing is true for the book of Jude, has all kinds of issues. It quotes 2 books that aren't in the Bible and seems to assume that they're in the Bible. 2, not even apocryphal books, but pseudepigraphal books that are, pseudepigrapha. Yeah. The Apocrypha, I have a Catholic Bible, so I have the Apocrypha in the Old Testament. And that's anywhere from 7 to 10 additional books, or certain books like the book of Daniel have additional sections. So my book of Daniel is a lot longer than your book of Daniel. And I also have extra books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees and things, Judith and not Esther, but other books. So that's the Old Testament Apocrypha. There's also the New Testament Apocrypha, which is not included in any New Testament. But these are dozens and dozens of Gospels. There's a Gospel according to Peter. There's the Proto-Evangelium of James. There's every person in the New Testament has several books in the New Testament Apocrypha. So if Peter wrote 2 books here, he's got several books in the New Testament Apocrypha and so forth. And these, by the way, they're all available. There's a Gospel according to Mary, Gospel according to Thomas, Judas. They're all over. Really interesting. And the next is a group called the Pseudepigrapha. And the Pseudepigrapha is written around the same time, a little before, and then during and after the New Testament. And we have all those books too. And it's hundreds of books. There's Gospels, and they're talking about very interesting things, Jewish and Christian. And so in the Pseudepigrapha, there's a book called First Enoch, and Jude quotes from First Enoch. And there's another book called The Assumption of Moses, Pseudepigrapha. We have both of those books, and Jude quotes from that one too. Where's the big no-no, right? He didn't get the memo that you're not supposed to quote those books, assuming that they're biblical or something along those lines. So those are some of the reasons why they're not accepted as much. If you look at that handout, we'll stay on that for a few more minutes. We kind of touched the thought question, but here's what's helpful, I think, to know about the book of Hebrews. If you turn on page 2, I have a chart, and the chart is not precise, but it just gets you to thinking in a certain way. Is basically the book of Hebrews is a sermon, and I have exposition, application, and mixture. So an exposition is just teaching on a specific topic. Application is an ongoing application or outworking of the exposition, and then a mixture where it goes back and forth. And it's helpful to know when you're reading through the book of Hebrews, there's different sections that are really exposition, other parts are really application. And once you know that, it's somewhat helpful. Another way to think about it is the book of Hebrews is a sermon. And sermons have a shape, they have a rhetorical structure to them. And so at some points you're really going in for the kill, and other points you come back. It's just like if you're watching a presidential speech or a debate or something along those lines. So you're emphasizing certain words and phrases, and maybe you'll repeat them several times, and then you kind of come back. So all good speakers, they know how to change their voice, they know how to change when they're going to really force something down on you, when they're going to pull back and be gentle with it. Strategy. It's the same thing with the book of Hebrews. So of all the books that we have in the Bible, this is really the only sermon. And you have to understand it as a sermon. In sermon, it's just like a season. It's like a life, it just has a season. You go in, you come out, and you repeat yourself. You focus in on specific things, and the same thing's true here for the book of Hebrews. And again, this isn't perfect. I was just in chapter 11, which is the very famous faith chapter, and I was looking at that. There's a few parts where it's not really exposition, it's more application. But just something helpful to think about. Summary, I think that the main part is chapter 12, and you see that section. What time is it? We have, okay, we've got a few minutes left. Ed, do you want to read just what I have here on Hebrews 12? This is, I think, a good summary of the book.
Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God.
Thanks. So you see, you can imagine this as a sermon for Jewish and Gentile Christians who are facing some type of persecution, or at least it's not a heavy persecution. He'll say later at the end, you've not gone to the point of actually shedding blood yet. But you're getting there, or at least it's under some type of persecution, and we want to urge you on, we want to encourage you in your faith to move forward despite the obstacles. So let's look at a couple of passages. There are several well-known passages in Hebrews. Let's look at the first one in chapter 6. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 4 to 6. And I'll read from my translation. Chapter 6, verse 4 to 6. As for those people who were once brought into the light, that is, they were probably baptized as Christians, and tasted the gift from heaven, and received a share of the Holy Spirit, and tasted the goodness of God's message, and the powers of the world to come, and yet in spite of this have fallen away, it is impossible for them to be brought to the freshness of repentance a second time, since they are crucifying the Son of God again for themselves, and making a public exhibition of him. So, depending on where you fall in the whole Calvinist, Arminian spectrum, Arminians love this passage and say, see, we come to know God, we make a decision we're going to follow God, and therefore we can make a decision not to follow God. And that helps us explain, which all of us have seen, that people say, I'm a Christian for a certain amount of time, or maybe they attend church for a certain amount of time, and then eventually they leave for whatever reason. And so you can think, well, what to do with that? Was that their decision? They were a Christian and they became an unchristian? Or will eventually God convict them and they will become a Christian again? Or they were never a Christian to begin with? Or whatever. So that's one passage. Let's look at it. It's got a companion passage in Hebrews chapter 9. And then we can talk about it. So if we look at verse, let's see. I can't find it. No, it's, I had it this morning and then I missed it. It's all right. It says the same thing, just in a slightly different way. Maybe I'll go back to it in a second. But the whole idea in Hebrews 6, at least, it's also there in that section as well. If you are a Christian and you come to know Jesus, you have the Holy Spirit, you're baptized and so forth, if you fall from that, then you cannot be grafted back in to the community of God. That's the whole idea. In the early church, it was believed that once you're baptized, if you sin again, then your baptism is undone and you're no longer a Christian. And so that's why a lot of people waited until the end of their lives to get baptized. For instance, Constantine, the emperor, was baptized on his deathbed. And the reason why is because it was his job to kill people, literally. The only way to get around that is to wait until you're, a few hours or days from death, and you're not going to be given that order anymore to go kill this person. And so you can be absolved of that sin, you can be baptized and not do it anymore. So that was a very common view in the early church. And so the question is, was that just a cultural thing? Or is that a transcendent, transcultural thing? You can't imagine. Well, there you go.
How many people, even in this room, you're baptized, you're confirmed, you grow up in the church, and you kind of fall away, and then you end up coming back.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't count.
Is the door closed?
Yeah, like, too darn bad, you stumble along the way, or
Well,
you,
what do you, yeah, absolutely.
had a little detour. I mean, that's kind of, it seems like, what's the point of that?
How many songs we've heard, we give up on God, but God doesn't give up on us.
Yeah,
Sounds
yeah.
like one big sermon.
How can you go out and sin boldly?
That's not what Luther thought. Yeah, Luther disagreed. He didn't care much for the book of Hebrews either. He hated James, and he didn't like Hebrews. He actually didn't like any of the letters, and that's why you say, well, why don't we spend as much time with these? It's because of Martin Luther. Right? There's a lot of things that we do and don't do in our churches, and it's because of one man. So he's a very influential person. He thought that James should be taken out of the canon, and he also would have said, while we're at it, let's put Hebrews, Jude, 2 Peter, Book of Revelation, and so forth in the trash can as well. And this is one of the reasons, because the content, this right here goes against what he believed. Yeah.
I don't understand how those things detract from faith. I mean, how can they, if you have faith, how can those things possibly hurt it? So what would be the objection to that? That's just sort of stupid.
Well, for the early Christians, it was, for us, it's so different because we're here, on Sunday morning, but then tomorrow a lot of us will go to work or we'll be involved in the world. And that was very different from the way the early Christians thought of themselves. It was, even though they were in the world in some way, it was much more of, you've made a pact that you are not going to be part of the world. And everything that you do is, just like the book of James, we didn't have time, but in James 4:4 he says, if you are a friend to God, you have to hate the world. Or the way he says it is, anyone who is a friend with God, anyone who is a friend with the world is an enemy to God. That's what he says, James 4:4. You're an enemy to God if you are a friend of the world. We're friends of the world. That's our culture. The only people who aren't are Amish or certain fundamentalists and so forth, right? But we're very friendly with the world. And so the New Testament authors and the early church would judge us, I think, for how friendly we are with the world. And we would judge them and saying that they are too harsh and that they were too reclusive, or whatever the word we want to use for them.
These early Christian communities were more sort of like, you think of the Amish, they're sort of, they were somewhat cloistered or kind of withdrawn, or they're sort of off on their own.
Yeah. I think that they, and it's somewhat harsh, but I think they took their faith more seriously than we do. And I include myself in that too. And I know that it was a lot easier to separate from the world than it is for us today. So If we have jobs, we get insurance, we live in the world. And it's very hard for us to be distinct from the world. We've become too cozy with it, perhaps. But for them, they didn't have the same culture where they had to be involved as much. And the community took care of themselves, and that's just something that we don't see as much. Again, the Amish really represent, they take care of their own. We don't really do a good as job. Now, hopefully there's individual churches, maybe there's small groups or something to do that, but by and large, we may not even know that this person lost their job or whatever. So we don't take as much care of them. That's just my take on it.
The evangelical part of Christianity, their job, their mission is to go out into the world.
Right.
And be a part of the
Yeah.
world and convert and
Mm-hmm.
evangelize. So, it's not a cloistered thing at all now.
Yeah.
Especially for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how do you be in the world and not of the world? That's,
Well, I think also, looking at the time and just the way the Jews were living, they were living as tribes.
Mhm.
They clearly had their own enclaves and their own little, certainly they had rules that
Right.
were very differentiated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was a way of living back then.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have it now it's turning into a monoculture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
A monoculture.
monocultural. Let's,
All right, so what did
What
we
did I say?
conclude here?
we concluded we need to go back to the first century and live in a commune, I think. Someone have a lot of money and land, we can just set up some houses together. Yeah. You got one? Okay. Yeah. Chapter 9. Yes, sir.
16. I think that's what we were talking about before, where a will is involved in death.
Mm-hmm.
For 17, where a will takes effect only at death. What is he saying here? What place did he say that there?
Yeah.
That's where the deathbed confession comes in?
No. No, what he's saying.
Call that in criminal, dying
Mhm.
declaration or something.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, what the author of Hebrews is saying, and the whole book is about Jesus. The book of Hebrews and Revelation are the two most Christ-centered. Exactly. He is the high priest. He's a perfect high priest. And so the Old Testament was all about the blood from goats and lambs and turtle doves and so forth. That was insufficient, and it was never really able to provide for atonement for sins. What's really needed was a human being and a sinless human being. And so that, of course, was Jesus. And that's what that whole will and testament is about. That it's now, we have a new testament, and that's based on Jesus' death and the shedding of his own blood. And so, as he said, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. And so in the Old Testament, the shedding of blood was from animals. Now it is from Jesus and so forth. It's not right?
I can't hear you.
I'm with you.
She agrees.
The only thing I could think in my own head is, like, a lot of times Dave points out, you have to take the whole thing. You can't just, I'm picking apart the words, and like,
Yeah.
even what you read is different from what I was reading. So I don't know where to draw the line sometimes. But I don't, it doesn't sound right to me that, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I understand. Well, here's one thing. We only have a few more minutes. We've got a couple of scientists in here. So I want us to talk about one thing. If you turn to Hebrews 11. I'm going to read the first 3 verses. And again, you were just saying, my version's a little different. It'll come out a little differently here, perhaps. But the same idea is there, I think. Verse 1, only faith can guarantee the blessings that we hope for, or prove the existence of realities that are unseen. It is for their faith that our ancestors are acknowledged. Verse 3, it is by faith that we understand that the ages were created by a word from God, so that from the invisible, the visible world came to be. And then we'll just fast forward to verse 6. The author says, now, it is impossible to please God without faith, since anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and rewards those who seek him. And so here's my question. I think the Earth is supposed to be something like 4.5 billion years old, or something along those lines. When we talk about the creation of the Earth, a lot of us don't necessarily pay as much attention to the book of Genesis for that. But how do we, as Christians, go back and look at the beginning of creation in relation to verse 3 and verse 6? And specifically, it's by faith that we understand that the ages were created by a word from God. And of course, he's referring back to Genesis 1, where in the beginning God speaks creation into existence. So, any ideas, responses? In other words, as Christians, you have to go back and look at it through faith, and yet so often we look at it scientifically. And so how do you put those two together? Obviously, we don't have time to finish this conversation. And it's an ongoing thing, but it just, when I was looking at it recently, it just caught me. I saw it in a different way before, where I just never had thought. It's like, you could almost interpret this as saying, forget about the science. The faith is you just have to believe that God created it, and that the way it's presented is somewhat similar to the way it is presented, or something along those lines, right?
If you think it is what, okay? So he's saying God thought it and it was. It became visible.
Yeah, I mean, God's word spoke it into existence, and when we're going back and looking at the science, like how much a role does that play in how we understand the beginning? Because he seems to be saying it's faith, right? It's faith.
When this was written, there was no science.
Well, certainly not as we understand it today.
There was no scientific explanation of the natural world, or the stars and the moon and all of that. They didn't even know the world was round.
Yeah.
They thought it was on a turtle going through. I don't know what they thought.
Yeah, I mean, they'd had a theological understanding of things. Yeah. Yeah.
There is such thing as neurons.
I mean, even if you accept the Big Bang,
Yeah.
something had to start it.
Oh, yeah, and, right, so I mean, but how does, then use just like a flat reading of this, right? You just see, it seems to suggest you just have to accept by faith that God created it in the way that it's somewhat offered in the book of Genesis, right? So, you don't read it that way? Okay, how do you guys read it?
Up to the point of, as it was stated in Genesis, it's like, okay, so I can accept that God created the world, but I don't have to know the details.
Yeah, I don't see Genesis as a scientific, treatise.
Oh, sure. No, yeah.
It's totally allegorical and the way that they understood it at the time. And I guess I don't have as big a conflict as
Yeah.
some people seem to have.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going back to the first one, which is
Yeah.
my Bible says faith, blah, blah, dot, 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 is the conviction of things not seen.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody then saw that.
Right.
Nobody then had any way of looking back into time as we do now using astronomy to see
Mhm.
what happened. So, yeah, we just have to have faith that this is what happened because we didn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's plenty of things we still don't know.
Right.
That you can talk.
All the ancient people made up myths to explain lightning and thunder and rain and floods. And it was all mythology.
Mm-hmm.
The Greeks and the Romans had the gods of everything. That was their explanation.
Mm-hmm. You're all so sophisticated. Most of the churches I speak to, this is big.
Science doesn't explain the why of the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Big Bang was, and that's it. Science can never tell you what happened before it, or whence it came.
Another Big Bang.
Impossible.
Yeah, they can tell you what happened, but not why.
Right. So that's the faith part.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I can tell you though, I mean, it's not so hard to say, okay, we call God's creating the universe the Big Bang. It's when you start looking at time periods and things like that people start to trip. And I actually still hit this a lot, but I'm an archaeologist. So I actually run into people a lot who are saying, why are you bothering with that? The earth isn't that old and you
Right.
don't need to worry about that. So it's still very important for a lot of people, and it's a hard thing to try to marry because you are seeing all this stuff like on the Science Channel or whatever, and then you have to reconcile that with the faith that you were brought up in too, and that's not so easy for everybody to do.
But that's only
Yeah.
true if you believe the Bible is literal.
Right.
You know, I mean, there's like a bazillion pieces of evidence to say that's just not right. So if you persist in
Right.
believing things that are wrong, you know,
But that is,
where's Apollo to bring the sun this morning? I mean, come on.
but the thing is, the majority of Christians in the world, in history as well as today, would favor a more flat or literal reading of the Bible. Absolutely, without doubt. And so if you look at all of the growth of Christianity, and our time has run out, but all of the growth of Christianity in places like Africa and Asia and Latin America, it's literalist. It's biblical literalist. And so that is the future. So it's interesting. There's something to think about, but that's the majority. I wish we had more time. This is good. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. Hopefully we can talk more about different things.